Hey guys, welcome to another episode of About Ukraine, and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the IT market in Ukraine and how foreigners and people looking to move to Ukraine can leverage this market and use it to their advantage. First of all, Ukraine is one of the leaders in the IT market, and the IT industry in Ukraine grows about 30% a year in terms of salaries, in terms of the number of qualified workers, in terms of the market share in general. And this is quite a remarkable trend when you think about it, and you're going to be hard-pressed to find it in any other industry in Ukraine at least. Recently, I came across the statistics at one of the leading job sites. The IT market in Ukraine was more or less an employer's market, and this trend is really changing. Now the market is slowly shifting to the job seeker instead of the employer. It's definitely yet to be seen what direction the market will go and who will favor more. Why is the IT industry so successful in Ukraine? I mean, there are really two reasons for it. The first one really is the government. It has a big role to play here, obviously. And I guess also the way brick and mortar businesses operate in Ukraine, that also plays a role. It's a much more hostile environment in Ukraine where the rule of law in terms of property rights constantly under question and under threat. Business owners that are looking to come to Ukraine, they understand that the Ukrainian market is small and there are small disposable incomes. It's not really a big attractive market, I believe, for many foreign businesses. But the Ukrainian government's attitudes towards the IT industry is really quite different. Ukraine is kind of towing a really careful line when it comes to the IT industry. It doesn't really want to scare investors away. They don't want to scare multinational IT companies or large IT companies that are doing outsourcing or they're doing research and development. They're building products here. They don't want to scare the investors away. Digital businesses obviously take all that into account, and they see the benefits of establishing a business in Ukraine or a presence in Ukraine. And then the money doesn't lie, right? They see Ukraine as a revenue opportunity, and they can use Ukraine in the form of geoarbitrage. The geoarbitrage is when you're utilizing the lower cost of labor in Ukraine and the lower overhead costs in terms of lower real estate prices to build value-added products. Another benefit to businesses is that depending on how you set up your business, you don't pay much taxes. You pay about 5% of tax in terms of your business and then when you receive your salary. But I'll get into that a little bit later. And despite that quite low tax rate of 5%, the Ukrainian government is taking in record revenues in terms of tax revenues. On average, IT companies pay over 3.5 times more taxes than an average business. And Ukrainian IT services actually bought in something like 10 billion hryvnias in taxes to the Ukrainian treasury, which is pretty good news for the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government also sees IT companies as a bit of a cash cow, and as that number is steadily going up, Ukrainian government doesn't really want to disturb the peace here, and they want to make sure everything goes smoothly. Well, so what is the IT market now, and how did it really get there? The IT market in Ukraine is relatively young. You could say that the IT market formed around 2010, and since then, the amount of growth that it's been getting has been quite astonishing. Today it employs around 190,000 specialists and generates about $5 billion in revenue. For a country like Ukraine, that's a lot of money. That makes up about 5% of the Ukrainian GDP. When I think about it, back in 2012, when I first visited Ukraine, the IT market was a low 0.8% of the Ukrainian GDP. And I personally didn't notice it. I don't think anybody really did. Nobody really thought much about IT specialists. There wasn't something that people wanted to start doing. At that time, physical products and things like raw materials, distribution, logistics, I remember even construction, all that took precedence over digital products or just IT work. Back then, outsourcing companies existed. Today, the big fives are the Palm, GlobalLogic, Luxoft, and about 60% of IT companies today are outsourcing companies, whereas 40% are product companies where they make some sort of a product. Now all these companies obviously they took a big hold of the market. They're the largest employers in the IT sphere, and they're really solidified their presence over the last few years. Today, the IT services and products market is a top 3 Ukrainian export. I mean, it's behind logistics and transport services, which is the number 1 industry in Ukraine. And that sort of makes sense since Ukraine is at a crossroads between all these countries like Europe. You have the access to the Black Sea, right? You have things coming in from China, that sort of thing. So the IT industry is in a really, really good position right now. The IT market is also quite decentralized here in Ukraine, which reduces risk for the employer. And now with remote working in place, many brands realize they don't really have an overhead of keeping an office running, and they can hire people from all over Ukraine, which greatly increases the reach and trying to find an applicable candidate. Obviously, Kyiv is the most popular location in Ukraine in terms of operating an IT company. It concentrates over half of such bases in the country. Other popular cities for research and development and product development are Dnipropetrovsk, Lviv, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Vinnytsia, and these are probably the top cities out there, and they're also quite big, dynamic cities with lots of talent. The most important thing, unlike Russia or Belarus, in Russia where it's a heavily spread out country, or Belarus where everything is concentrated within like 1 or 2 cities, in Ukraine all of these cities are relatively close together, about at maximum 500 kilometers or 300 miles apart. Ukraine is also quite connected, so it's easy to get around. Populations are also quite evenly distributed across countries. And I guess last but not least, salaries don't really have that much of a big difference from place to place. Obviously in Kyiv you're going to get the higher salaries. However, people constantly move around, and if you're a large company, you will try to maintain a presence in every large city in Ukraine. So for the last point is, how do you get a job in IT in Ukraine? Well, most companies prefer to pay people officially, and if you're a good specialist, they can help you out with your documentation. However, they would obviously much rather hire locals. Any IT company would much rather switch to the legal way of doing things and deposit your salary into a Ukrainian bank account. So from the point of view of an employer, they have 2 options. They can either hire you unofficially, which is self-explanatory. They would pay you in cash, they would pay you under the table, they wouldn't register you officially, or they can hire you through the official channels. I must reiterate, so if you're a tourist and you coming into the office looking for work, let's say you're in Ukraine for 3 months, or like however long you are, you can't really expect the company to hire you officially that way. I mean, if they were to do that, they would have to give you an official work permit, and in order to do that, they would have to contact the Migration Service of Ukraine. They essentially have to explain why they should hire you instead of a local. From the government's point of view, they're obviously not really interested in having a foreigner take a job of a local. But for an IT company, they're usually stuck between the rock and a hard place, really. It's the overhead for them is small, and something like 80% of the expenses that an IT company has is really salaries. It's basically salaries for the employees. And talent remains the biggest issue as well. Talented PHP developers, JavaScript, you name it. Not only talented developers, it's hard to find. There could be a talent shortage looming ahead. So from the point of view of the IT business, what they like to do is they like to hire people that are self-employed. So basically the way it works is that a self-employed entrepreneur pays about 5% in tax, as I mentioned. So it applies to both the IT company and you as a salaried worker. And that thing is called a FOP, which is essentially a sole proprietorship. And 80% of people work in this way in the IT industry anyway. Basically, as long as you're a Ukrainian citizen or you're a foreigner on a temporary residence permit, you can open a FOP. And in order to do that, you need a Ukrainian tax code, which is extremely similar to the US Social Security number. Along with the Ukrainian ID number and your temporary residence permit and your address, you can essentially use these 3 things to open a FOP account. And when the company actually pays you, that money gets transferred into your FOP account, which you can then withdraw into your personal account. And you control these accounts. However, there's usually an accountant affiliated with the IT company, and they usually handle all the little bank details and all the taxes which you end up paying independently. Anyway, I hope this information was somewhat useful and gave you an idea of the IT market in Ukraine. And if you like this information, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.